can you speak so we know that we actually can hear you, Ben?
Yes. Hi, Sheila. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you.
Okay, perfect. So, wonderful. So then I think we can probably start, I think. We will hopefully have a few more people come in, but the first bit is just me, doing the housekeeping and all of that. So it's not so important. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and welcome to our third Thursday Science Webinar. My name is Sheila Heymans. I'm the Executive Director of the Marine Board, and I will be the moderator today. Oopsie, let me just get the slides to move. Okay, so I will start with some housekeeping rules. Let me just hide this. Floating meeting. There we go. Some housekeeping rules. Please make sure that your name is clearly entered so that when you ask questions, we can see who you are. You have to use the Q&A, which should be at the bottom of your screen, to ask questions. And if you do that, please also say where you're from, which country, what organization. That helps us to formulate the questions better. If you have any technical issues, like Ben did, please just use the chat. If you can't get in, then maybe you want to email us, but please use the chat for any technical support. And please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on our website and our YouTube channel afterwards. So, what are we talking about today? We're talking about navigating coherence in EU marine policies. It is linked to our position paper on building coastal resilience in Europe, but it's also linked to our series Navigate the Future 6. And I would say it's very important for the discussions that are currently being had on the European Ocean Pact. So it's a very timely conversation to be had. We have 3 speakers today. Froukje Maria Platjouw, who is a research manager and senior researcher from the Norwegian Institute of Water Research, NIWA. And she's the project coordinator for the CrossGov Project, which is the project I think we're talking about here. And then Ben Boteler, who is a senior research associate at the Research Institute for Sustainability at GFZ, and maybe you will explain what that is, Ben. And then Micah Knoll-Kaufman, who is an extra panelist and will be able to help answer any questions that they might have, and luckily does not have to present Ben's slides for us. So I think that's it from me. I will stop sharing, and then Froukje will start sharing, and then yeah, you can take it away.
Yes, thanks a lot, Sheila, for the introduction. I'll just get this in my presenter mode. Hi, everyone. Good to see you. So my name is Froukje Maria Platjouw from NIWA. I was the coordinator of CrossGov. It just finished a couple of months ago, end of August. So we had this 3-year project with a lot of interesting results. And this is also the background for the presentation today. So welcome to the webinar. The basic question for us before we started the project was actually, okay, what's happening with the oceans? And a lot is happening, and the oceans basically are in trouble, and so are we as a society. There are warming waters, acidification, sea level rise, a lot of problems and biodiversity loss, a lot of pollution, and a lot of unsustainable human activities. And at the same time, of course, we need our ocean for our survival. So there are a lot of issues happening at the oceans, and we are regulating and governing a lot of these issues in silo. We're often regulating one pressure at a time, one sector at a time, one problem at a time, and there are a lot of policies that govern and regulate different problems. And this fragmented approach, it undermines a little bit our ability to tackle the real interconnected challenges facing the ocean. And that brings us to the discussion for today, which is policy coherence. How can we govern the ocean in a more integrated and holistic manner? And crucially, what can policy coherence bring in this situation? So if we think about policy coherence, and if we think about the fragmentation of environmental law and environmental governance, I think we all remember that scientific publication for a couple of years ago with this horrendogram of policies and laws and regulations, basically showing that we have very many policies that regulate parts of the coastal marine ecosystems, that regulate parts of the problem, parts of sectoral activities, and that protect parts of the biodiversity in the marine ecosystem. So we have a very fragmented approach to how we govern the ecosystem. So policy coherence is quite essential if we want to move into the same direction and if we want to make this movement effective. Policy coherence, it implies basically that all the policies that we do have, that they work well together. So both on paper, but also when you think about implementation on the ground, on the different governance levels, all these policies, they need to function well together so that if we work within the context of one policy, these kind of efforts and activities do not go at the expense of our efforts to implement other policies. So we should avoid trade-offs and we should try to get synergistic decision-making, policy-making and planning. There is currently a lot of need for policy coherence with many of the policy areas in Europe, under the Water Framework Directive, the MSFD, the Habitats Directive and the Nature Restoration Regulation, all very important instruments. They need to be synergetic with what's happening under the common fisheries policies, the renewable energy directives, etc. So policy coherence is important. We will talk about this today, and we will also then give some examples specifically from one of the clusters that we have studied, which is offshore wind and biodiversity. First, a little bit about coherence. There are, of course, different dimensions of coherence. In the project and in general, we look into vertical coherence, which is basically the alignment of efforts and the alignment of governance approaches across the different governance levels. So if we have ambitions from the European Commission, ambitions from the Green Deal, ambitions from the Ocean Pact, these ambitions should also translate back into the national member states levels, agendas, and the regional agendas and the local policy agendas. So these kind of like vertical governance levels, they should kind of work towards the same objectives and visions. And then we have horizontal coherence, which basically means coherence between policies and governance approaches across different policy areas, but also within policy areas, because it's so fragmented. You need also coherence within the biodiversity pillar, within the energy pillar, within the climate pillar, within the transportation pillar, etc. But across these areas, there is also a lot of need for horizontal coherence. In the coastal marine environment, this is particularly relevant because of the ecosystem. That's basically one ecosystem from land to sea, from source to sea, where we need coherence between land-based activities, the governance of those, the coastal ecosystem activities there, and the pressures on the marine environment. So obviously, from an ecosystem perspective, this is all interconnected. So therefore, the governance system also needs to be coherent and interconnected. So what level of policy coherence do we actually want? And this is a very normative question. It's not easy to say, okay, we do need coherence, but what do we actually mean by that? Because coherence is not a black and white phenomenon. Something is not just coherent or incoherent, but there are many different shades of coherence. And we can also have different ambitions for different sets of policies. So when, for instance, think about policies that belong to the same policy area, let's say biodiversity policies like the MSFD, the Nature Restoration Regulation, the Habitats Directive, belonging to the biodiversity pillar, I think for this set of policies, we can have a high ambition in terms of policy coherence. So this should be quite enabling, reinforcing, supporting one another, and making one another a strong set of policies. But sometimes there are also policies that belong to different areas, like biodiversity policies and sectoral policies, like fisheries or renewable energy. And here, maybe the ambition is obviously a little bit lower because these are not, of course, reinforcing one another, but the minimum that we think is necessary for these sets of policies is that it should be consistent. At least they should not negatively impact one another. They should not hinder one another's compliance and implementation. So consistency from our point of view is kind of the minimum requirement in general. But policies that really belong to the same group, they should be really strongly harmonized and coherent. And generally, the idea is that the further up you go in this figure, the easier it is to actually create synergies and win-win outcomes and positive interactions between policies. The further down the scale you go, it might not be very effective governance, because when you implement something that goes at the expense of something else, you need to make a trade-off, and it also means that you're not able to implement and achieve all the different policy objectives from these policies. So this might be a problem. It might be a problem under the Green Deal, where you have a lot of ambitions and visions that need to be applied and complied with. It might also be a problem in the Ocean Pact, which also tries to cover a lot of different policy objectives and interests. So synergy is the kind of the main vision and the main purpose. What we did in the project is to make a framework to assess policy coherence, because even though we think that policy coherence is important, it's still a challenge to really study policy coherence and to understand how to evaluate it and how to assess it. Policy coherence is, as a little bit of a background, it's one of the 5 criteria that the European Commission is using when they evaluate policies. So when they do fitness checks, they assess these policies on the basis of added value, relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, and coherence. For each of these criteria, there are instructions and guidelines, but for policy coherence, the guidance is quite generic and short, of course, so that it can fit many different policy areas. But often the result is that policy coherence is assessed in quite many different ways, with different levels of depth. And we think there is a strong potential to do more efficient and harmonized assessments if the guidance to understand and to assess policy coherence is a little bit more detailed and guiding. And then the idea is, of course, that, okay, if we enable better assessments and promote more coherent policies, this can also enable policy effectiveness, so the achievement of the ambitions for the oceans. What we developed is a handbook. So the framework that we developed is the methodology, which I will describe very quickly after this. But the whole methodology is then disseminated through what we call the handbook. The handbook is a website where you can click into. It has different components and a lot of examples and a lot of guiding questions, which can help you very easily to tackle a policy coherence assessment. It has also downloadable functions. So we have a full PDF available with the guidance and the guiding questions and the examples. And we also have like a quick guide if you just want to have the guiding questions, for instance, without all the examples and the notes. So this is the website, which might be interesting for you to explore. A little bit about the framework. So what is actually our methodology, our methodological framework? It's a quite comprehensive framework, first of all. And with comprehensive, we mean that it consists of 2 parts. It not only helps you to understand the level of policy coherence between policies, but it also helps you to understand why we observe a certain level of policy coherence. Sometimes we just observe and we notify that the level of policy coherence between the Water Framework Directive and the MSFD might be a little bit low. And that's it. But we sometimes also want to understand why this is the case. And this part B of our framework helps you to understand what could be possible reasons for observing low levels of coherence between policies. And once you understand the reason for it, this is also where you can start doing something about it. Because there are a lot of different reasons for why something might be coherent or incoherent. but once you know why, you might also you might also assess if this is possible to do something about, or could it be mitigated in any way, or could it be made easier, or could it be resolved at certain levels of governance, maybe at the EU level in the design of the policies, maybe in the implementation of the policies by the local actors. So this is a comprehensive framework. It is also a neutral framework, which means that it's not really normative. It doesn't bring you from a state of incoherence to a higher level of coherence. It's not in that way guiding, but it's neutral in the way that it provides you guiding questions. It provides you criteria, almost as a kind of a checklist to make sure that you have thought about all the elements that could affect policy coherence. So it's a quite comprehensive and a full framework. You can choose and pick whatever part you like and whatever part you would be interested in for your specific research. And you can also select the particular elements from understanding. For instance, if you want to know more about governmental reasons or data-related arguments for policy incoherence, or reasons connected to stakeholder involvement, for instance. So as I said, for both parts of the framework, we have designed guiding questions. For part A of the framework, where we assess the level of policy coherence, we look into the objectives, whether these are sufficiently aligned in terms of substance, like what do they actually cover and what do they not cover, geographically, like where do they apply, and temporally, like in terms of timeframes for their achievement, for the monitoring, the reporting, for the reporting periods, etc. And we also look a little bit more into depth, because often the coherence is also very much related to the legal bindingness of these directives. Are the differences in whether they have objectives of best effort, objectives of result, are the objectives and the targets, are they qualitative? Are they vague? Are they quantitative and measurable? Which often means that they are more easy to enforce as well. And some directives and policies also have quite some exemptions, which make them sometimes a little bit weaker in terms of enforcement and bindingness. So these kind of questions are then guiding for the coherence assessment, and these are then described in the policy handbook with a lot of examples then from coastal and marine governance, because CrossGov was all about coastal and marine governance. We also focus on measures, because from our point of view, measures are quite influential on the level of policy coherence. Sometimes this assessment of measures may reveal that there are very strong measures for certain objectives, but maybe no measures or more weaker measures for other objectives. And this also has some kind of impact on to what extent policies are coherent with one another or not. If they're not supported by any actionable measures that ensure implementation, not a lot will change. So for these measures, we have guiding questions as well. Then for part B, no, sorry, this was an example first before we go into part B. We will talk a little bit later about the offshore wind and biodiversity cluster, but I can already say now that offshore wind and biodiversity is one of the areas and the cases that we've been looking into, because the Green Deal sets a lot of ambitions for both offshore wind energy acceleration and development, but also quite some targets and visions for biodiversity protection and restoration. So the question is, okay, how can these two go hand in hand? And there are some problems or challenges as a starting point. Offshore wind installations, they can of course disrupt the life cycles of fish and other species, and they also need considerable spatial needs. So these kind of spatial issues might be a problem if the space is limited in certain countries, or if the space is needed for other things. And there is also still a lack of knowledge on marine biodiversity. So the question is basically, is offshore wind, is that governance framework and the landscape and the landscape and the governance regime for biodiversity protection, are they sufficiently integrated? On a kind of like high level perspective from the EU, to some extent they are interlinked, but to some extent they're also kind of like interlinked in a way which undermines a little bit marine biodiversity protection. We do have, of course, like the RED+, the RED 3 directives. And we have this regime for the protection of marine biodiversity, particularly by Natura 2000 directives and the MSFD, and now also with the nature restoration law, where as a starting point, these renewable energy projects are prohibited in Natura 2000 areas. But in RED 3, there is then this exemption from the regulation, which says that, okay, there is an exemption for projects which are of renewable energy natures because these are projects of overriding public interest. And by kind of making this exemption as a starting point, these projects fall outside of the prohibition from the Habitats Directive. So the question is basically, okay, are the nature directives and the MSFD, are they strong enough actually to really protect marine environment from offshore wind and other pressures? And on the other hand, the question is also, okay, are biodiversity concerns really integrated well enough in climate and energy policies? So these are kind of the questions that we have been looking into, and we still wonder if this really is the case, if marine biodiversity and marine ecosystems really are protected sufficiently enough by the biodiversity legislation. MSFP, marine spatial planning, might be the answer in theory, but in practice we often see that marine spatial planning is often used to foster and to facilitate blue growth, and not always easy to protect biodiversity in that picture. So a little bit about part B of the framework, which is about understanding policy incoherence. So why do we observe a certain level of policy coherence or incoherence? And for this, we have developed 3 main categories of explanatory factors. So the first category is related to governmental organizations, related to how how public actors and authorities affect the design and the implementation of policies. This might be related to responsibilities, to mandates, resources, capacity, those kind of questions. The other category is related to science policy society interfaces. So it's more related to the production and the transfer and the use of data and knowledge during the lawmaking and the legislative process, but also during the implementation of the law. What kind of data is used? How is data affecting decision-making processes and planning decisions? We sometimes see that this is handled quite differently in the different sectors that are operative in the marine environment. So this process can also influence policy coherence. And then finally, the stakeholder involvement category, basically how stakeholders like lobbyists and other NGOs, industries and other groups affect policy and decision making. There's quite a lot of literature on this topic, especially with regard to the representation of different groups of stakeholders, their lobbying power, their influential power with regard to resources that they use, capacity that they have, the relationships that they have with policymakers and lawmakers. So these processes are also quite influential on the level of policy coherence in the design phase, but also in the implementation phase. So for this part of the framework, we also have these 3 overarching categories of explanatory factors. And then within each of these categories, we have like subcategories, kind of based on the literature. So it was based on a systematic literature review, where we identified factors that belong to this category. And for each of these factors, then we have guiding questions, and we have examples from literature, mainly focusing on coastal marine governance. But this is very helpful, we think, to help you to understand why we observe a certain level of policy coherence, and also to make sure that you've thought of all the possible explanations and factors that could actually play a role to policy coherence. So that was the kind of the overall introduction to the concepts and what we did in the project. And then I would like to hand it over to Ben to say a little bit more how we applied this in the context of offshore wind and biodiversity within 3 of our countries from the project. So Ben, I will click for you and you go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Froukje. Very nice to be here. My name is Ben Boteler. I'm from the Research Institute for Sustainability in Potsdam, Germany. So we were one of the participating partners in the CrossGov project. And I'm going to present today briefly on some of the results of this biodiversity and offshore wind cluster. So along with colleagues, Micah, who's included here, we explored the ideas of policy coherence, in Germany, the Netherlands, and Norway. Next slide. So as I mentioned, today's focus is the North Sea, which is then often referred to as Europe's green power plant for the future. And 9 countries, including Germany and the Netherlands and Norway, signed the 2023 Ostend Declaration, seeking to boost offshore wind energy production to 300 gigawatts by 2050. And this, of course, then potentially conflicts with the biodiversity goal to protect 30% of marine areas by 2030. And this is particularly alarming considering the 2023 OSPAR quality status reports, which highlights the poor state of the North Sea and emphasizes actually the need to carefully balance offshore wind energy production with biodiversity. So with this in mind, we asked ourselves, okay, how coherent are national governance frameworks in aligning these high-level energy and biodiversity goals? Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we sought to explore, we implemented the CrossGov policy coherence framework, and in particular, I want to pick up on the 3 explanatory factors. So that's the governmental organizations, stakeholder engagement, and the science policy society interface processes in the 3 countries. And what we did is conducted a policy legal review, document review, focusing on upcoming or ongoing policy discussions in each of these countries. Also conducted a number of interviews and participated and coordinated several workshops to explore these questions. Just one caveat, which is that much of the research was conducted earlier in the year or even last year, and as this is an ongoing policy discussion, a lot of things are changing quite rapidly in the field. Next slide, please. So what did we find out about Germany? Germany is certainly a forerunner when it comes to energy production and currently has 9.2 gigawatts installed in their waters, with a 30 gigawatt goal by 2030 and 70 by 2045. We found that the German approach is quite highly structured, and the German Offshore Wind Energy Act sets out clear targets and the application of specific planning tools like marine spatial planning, but also site development plans. However, strategic environmental assessments, which are intended to work hand in hand with MSPs, are also applied, but conducted early at the basin level. And also, as mentioned by Froukje already, offshore wind energy production is given this legal status of overriding public interest in the German North Sea. It's also important to point out that much of the German EEZ, the exclusive economic zone, has already been allocated in terms of spatial use, and so it's highly competitive in terms of spaces. And a number of challenges remain. For example, impact assessments often lack significant depth on cumulative impacts, and sensitivity mapping is inconsistently applied through the assessments. We also found there's significant institutional silos within Germany, where much of the planning, assessment, and ultimately sort of decision making is conducted through the energy agencies, or sorry, through the BSH, through the planning agency of Germany, and stronger coordination and the application of ecological data to ensure biodiversity is not sidelined needs to be strengthened. Going to the Netherlands, they have a much different approach. We could say it's more adaptive and inclusive. They currently have around 4.7 gigawatts installed, with a target of 21 by 2032 and 70 by 2050. So also very ambitious in terms of energy production, like Germany. But what stands out here is that the Netherlands has established the North Sea program, which aims to integrate offshore wind, biodiversity and fisheries, as well as nature conservation and other uses, including a stakeholder platform like the North Sea Agreement and the Community of Practice, really as an effort to foster collaboration and innovation across these different sectors. Also, the Netherlands has established a one-stop shop permitting system to streamline approvals and speed up tender procedures, but also to include non-price ecological criteria and reward developers who go beyond minimum environmental standards. So the Netherlands has gone, I think, quite far in terms of inclusive or integrated governance at the local level. But there's still concerns with stakeholder engagement and integrating biodiversity into offshore wind practices. They've also developed a framework for ecological and cumulative effects, the KEC, but this is still evolving, but it is with the aim of assessing broader ecosystem impacts. Of course, there's still a risk that offshore wind expansion will outpace the capacity of sort of this tool to address biodiversity concerns. Looking to Norway, you could say, is taking a more cautious approach, but there's still a need for stronger cross-sectoral integration, as well as tools to ensure that biodiversity is not left behind. For example, Norway has established 1.1 gigawatts installed, is seeking to establish 30 by 2040, so it's also quite a large target. And they've established 20 areas for the use of offshore wind, indicated by the boxes on the map there. And overall has an area which has an area similar to that of Germany's economic exclusive zone. So it gives you a bit of an idea of the differences in space between these two countries. Definitely Norway's strength lies in its knowledge-based approach. Strategic environmental assessments are conducted early and are in quite detail, covering ecological, social, and regulatory dimensions. However, it lacks a formal maritime spatial planning process, but in a way makes up for this through the use of ecosystem-based management plans, that are updated regularly and include a framework for particularly valuable and vulnerable areas, which are the green areas there on the map. But there's no clear guidelines in these plans for the planning of offshore wind in or near these valuable areas. So overall coordination with the EBM plans is relatively weak. And also we found that environmental authorities tend to have limited influence on decision making. Also, within Norway, there's no legal protection for marine areas beyond 12 nautical miles, but this is being planned. So overall, we could say the Netherlands really shows a strong application of ecological criteria and the use of stakeholder platforms to bring together stakeholders at the local level. Germany tends to stick to long-term planning, focusing on clarity and accelerating the uptake of offshore wind energy through its structured approach. However, it remains relatively siloed in terms of organizations and institutions. And Norway focuses on more of a knowledge-based approach through the early application of strategic environmental assessments and its ecosystem-based management plans. In terms of improving policy coherence, a couple of takeaways. I think one being that impact assessments, including SAAs, are often conducted quite late or too narrow to shape meaningful outcomes, so bringing biodiversity into actual decision-making processes. There's a real concern or challenge that the RED III directive and the application of overriding public interest potentially puts more pressure on the marine environment, fast-tracking provisions for offshore wind, which undermine environmental safeguards. And lastly, the regional coordination for managing cumulative impacts and sharing data and infrastructure demonstrates a real possibility to maybe move away from also these national approaches, but considering also more regional approaches to managing cumulative impacts or even sharing data or aligning infrastructure planning. So a clear opportunity for how to explore in the future how such mechanisms at the regional level could be improved or considered for regional level policy coherence. Thank you. I'll leave it there and happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, all both of you, and Michael for still being there. For everybody online, you are more than welcome to use the Q&A, as I mentioned, to put any questions in there. But in the meantime, we have pre-prepared some questions for you until people get their thinking caps on. So if I can find the pre-prepared questions. The first one is, how do you think this would really be implementable in the EU Ocean Act, the Ocean Pact? How do you think, I mean, the Commission really is pushing for coherence. They're pushing for making things easier and making it easier for the member states to get through all of these directives. How can they really implement it? What is the, if you can say, this is one thing that you really will need to do to make it happen, what would that be? I don't know who wants to go with that. Micah?
Yes, thank you. I can give this a go, I think.
Okay.
And then reflecting on this mostly from the perspective of offshore wind and biodiversity, but also strongly at the national level then to complement a bit what Ben has been saying. One of the key priorities of the Ocean Pact is, of course, to protect and restore ocean health. And I think one of the key issues then is that ecological knowledge, as Ben also said, needs to come in early and needs to come in strategically. In the identification of areas for offshore wind, but also during impact assessments, looking beyond the focus on impacts on single species, but incorporate a more wider ecosystem approach. So what impacts does offshore wind have on the wider ecosystem? And of course, there will never be complete knowledge up front. There will always be uncertainties. So I think coherence also depends on an adaptive approach, that there is a focus on adaptation, on keeping, updating these strategic impact assessments continuously, but also having plans for opening low risk areas first, and then adapting those plans as new knowledge is under development. And the second point, with the upcoming Ocean Act and the revision of the MSPD, this also creates opportunities to strengthen that role of environmental authorities, as both of them have reflected on, and to stimulate cross-sectoral collaboration in governance. As our case studies have shown, many countries show that environmental authorities have an advisory role, mostly in these planning processes and the impact assessment processes, but also in defining criteria in in offshore wind tenders. So defining the ecological criterion there. And these criteria can reflect like the larger restoration commitments, but also the more local scale nature and inclusive design models. And I think environmental authorities can have a strong role there, to reflect those commitments when developing offshore wind.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to come back on the discussions about the SEAs, and I mean, this is not my field, but I remember way back when I worked in Scotland, that I understood that in the UK at least, they were really trying to bring most of the impact assessments for most of the work, things happening in this, spatial things happening in the sea, kind of together in SEAs, and that there was talk about why this is something that the UK should pay for the UK waters. That, it shouldn't be bitty environmental impact for one in one area and then in another. And is that what you're advocating for? That, say, you would do a SEA for the whole of the North Sea to look at the ecological places in the North Sea, for instance, where where is everything, and where can we still put these renewable devices? Or is that not what you guys are proposing? Anybody?
I think it's both. I think indeed it's good to have these basin level SEAs, because that will give an opportunity to work on cumulative impact assessments, which are really cumulative in the sense that you can bring in the impacts of different sectors on different parts of the ecosystem, which is extremely necessary. On the other hand, I think it's very good also to have these more fragmented SEAs looking into areas, because you can go deeper, and you can look into the impacts of an activity upfront and the different solutions before an EIA, so a project-specific impact assessment, is conducted. So I think both are needed. Yeah.
But also, if we imagine, and I know the Belgian, the coastline, Belgium, France, and the Netherlands are so close to get claustrophobic, and the UK, they're all kind of in there. I know there's a lot of talk in Belgium and in the Netherlands, that the Netherlands put their wind farms right on the border with Belgium, or the other way around, and then it has an impact on the ecology downstream. So if you do this at a country level, you're never going to actually get the environmental impact assessment done properly. Surely if you you have to take into account all of the stakeholders, and that would be the people in the country next to you. So how can we do this better in that sense?
Maybe just to add or to come in, I also agree that having a sort of a regional level assessment or a regional level SEA, although maybe it would be called a different term in the end, but could be really quite something to assess exactly these transboundary impacts. We of course know that impacts are not bound by these national boundaries, and there is a requirement within the SEA directive to include this transboundary consideration. However, in practice, at least I can say from Germany, it's they're very aware of the close connection to the Dutch seas when they're planning their offshore wind farms. But beyond sort of acknowledging that connection, at least as far as I'm aware, there's not really any transboundary engagement or transboundary assessment taking place, which could actually address any degradation to biodiversity or other ecosystem impacts.
Froukje?
Yeah, I wanted to add a little bit on these transboundary impacts, because I think we could also maybe look a little bit into the Nature Directive, the Habitats Directive, and this requirement for appropriate assessments. And in that context, there is a very clear requirement that you should assess the impacts on Natura 2000 areas, also in your neighboring countries. So if you do anything in the Netherlands, you need to make sure that protected areas in Germany and the UK and Belgium are not affected by your activities. So maybe a combination between appropriate assessments and CAAs and those kind of things would be interesting to explore. But I wanted actually to come back to the very first question about the Ocean Pact. Because the Ocean Pact is talking a little bit implicitly quite a lot about policy coherence. And coherence seems to be quite an important aspect, an important driver for the Ocean Pact. At the same time, I think we should be a little bit cautious about the aspirations for it, because it's you could say it's another instrument on top of all the others. So even though you add a policy instrument which really maybe strengthens and favors policy coherence, it doesn't resolve the existing challenges and the existing problems that we have between certain directives and between certain regulations. Those will not be resolved by just adding an Ocean Pact on top of it, right? So it's not something that's going to replace the whole fragmented landscape of what's already there. So we should take into consideration, okay, how is this then working with the existing policy landscape that we do already have, and that's already being implemented in the member states and other countries? And what is the added value of the Ocean Pact? And of course, it's not binding. So the Ocean Act that will come next year, I think it will replace the MSPD, the Marine Spatial Planning Directive. Also there, it will be very interesting to see then if this new Ocean Act is going to be better in terms of ensuring coherence with the biodiversity directives, with the MSFD, if marine spatial planning plans, if they are going to be able to promote more environmental outcomes through the marine spatial planning plans, because so far they have been very neutral, and maybe even fostering and strengthening blue growth initiatives and sectoral activities. They have not been very strong in helping the facilitation or helping the implementation of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, for instance. So it could be interesting to see if this upcoming Ocean Act is going to make that connection between those two directives stronger. So it's a very exciting period to follow these new policy initiatives.
Maybe on this point, you must be aware, or maybe you're not aware, there will be a call for evidence come out for the Ocean Act, the Ocean Observing Initiative, and the Ocean Pact. and the Ocean Research and Innovation Strategy. All of these things will be coming out in the next couple of weeks or months. So definitely this is something that we should all highlight, that this is something that should be in it. So when it comes out for the Ocean Act, we should definitely make sure that they bring that into there, so that it's, so if we point it out, then they have to take it account. At least they have to respond to it. So that's quite important.
Yeah, if I can just add, Sheila,
Yeah,
if I can just add, like, if someone is particularly interested in the results from the CrossGov project, because now we only presented some of the results, but the project has been quite broad, and we have also been looking into other policy clusters, and also looking into like the policy coherence at the EU level between all these directives in general. So if someone is particularly interested, we have quite some policy briefs on the website, like CrossGov.eu, I think, where we have also a policy brief on, okay, how could policy coherence be strengthened in the Ocean Pact and the Ocean Act based on the results and the findings from our research project. So that's the website.
Okay. And Ben? Yeah, just a really quick comment. Coming to talk about the Ocean Pact and the future Ocean Act. I think when you read the Ocean Pact now, the word coherence or policy coherence is not really in there very often. I think maybe not at all or once, but it's mentioned in maybe other terms. I think what's two of them, of course, which are interesting is the ecosystem-based approach and the source-to-sea approach, which are two of the four principles that the Future Ocean Act are to be based on, or are supposed to guide the Future Ocean Act, which is quite interesting. I think especially, we've been talking about offshore wind and biodiversity, but thinking also about if it truly to implement a source-to-sea approach, this would also then require policy coherence, sort of in a different upstream, downstream sort of consideration when you talk especially about pollution or agriculture, and which were other policy clusters which we explored in CrossGov. So it just adds a new dimension of thinking about policy coherence. Yeah, thanks. There's more of a comment from Juan Ranco in the Q&A. He says, clearly this is one of the issues that the Ocean Act should include: compulsory, coordinated, integrated environmental assessments at sea basin level. Interesting to check the coherence of this with what the MSFD mandates at sea region level. So I think that's definitely something that we should include. There is another question that we had, which was, how can a locked-in perspective be overcome when improving policy coherence? I think you mentioned that in the case of Germany, Ben. How can you fix that if you have a very specific type of personality, people there? Yeah, I can start, and maybe Froukje and Micah also have some ideas. I mean, I think, as Froukje mentioned earlier in her presentation, it's sort of a normative idea of policy coherence. It's something to be aspired towards, but it's a moving target, right? So there's really no silver bullet to achieve policy coherence, but by considering it and moving down to the local level, I think especially where EU or national level policies are really ultimately always implemented at the local level. I think here designing and considering ways in which policy coherence can be taken up, and that's not just sort of say we need a checkbox, a list of things that are done, but really looking at the great example of the Netherlands of designing a stakeholder platform which brings together diverse groups, diverse perspectives on those policy objectives, and allowing sort of new considerations or new ideas to be triggered at the local level to overcome maybe some of the challenges in coherence. So yeah, I think by considering sort of the interconnections of those policies at the local level, maybe through a stakeholder platforms, engaging with those individuals or those actor groups, but also designing scientific platforms are really a possibility. So to sort of rethink some of that local level implementation of those higher level policies.
Okay. And then I think we only have 4 minutes left, but there's a question from David Connor in the Q&A as well, which I think we could take as well. How can societal, economic and biodiversity demands best be balanced at a regional scale when individual policies invariably favor one aspect and strong biodiversity policies will usually lose out? So David Connor is a former MSFD implementer from DG Environment. Nice to see you, David. So I don't know if there's an answer to that, because I think it's a very important point that, you know, it's a little bit like how can you value ecosystem services that has no monetary value? It's the same thing, you know, how can you ensure that the policies you always, you know, don't lose out on the biodiversity? I don't actually know if we have an answer, but if anybody has a great idea, now is the last 3 minutes to mention them.
I don't think we have an answer, but I think this is obviously the thing that we researchers really would like to hear from the policymakers. So especially from the DGs, how they foresee this to be resolved and how we then as a research community can help resolving it. I don't think we have the answer ourselves, but it clearly needs a very good collaboration between the policymakers and the lawmakers and the European Commission that's responsible for these policies and their implementation, and how we can then help implement them together with actors and authorities at the other levels to really make this happen. But it's a very difficult question.
Yeah. Okay, do you have something else to add, Ben or Micah? Yeah, I think if I had to answer that question, I would say that the only way you can get policymakers to do anything is to make sure that the people ask for it. And so the only way you can do that is for people to understand that biodiversity is important and to ask for that. So then if it's something that's really important, then they have to incorporate it. I think that's the best we can do, but that's maybe not a satisfactory answer, but I don't know if we have a better one. So thank you very much. I think we are just about ready to go. I know we have a few more questions that we had in the backup there, but I think this was a very exciting discussion. So thank you very much for your time. I think there's only one thing left, and that is for me to say that our next webinar will be in January, but we don't actually have a speaker yet. So we will confirm. I might as well stop sharing that screen then. We will let people know on our social media when the speaker is there and what the date is. It's usually the third Thursday, so it will probably be the third Thursday in January, but we will let you know who the speaker is. And thank you very much to the three of you for a very exciting discussion. And yeah, I look forward to looking at the handbook and the websites of the other examples that you had. So thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.